Welcome back to the SDG Warriors Podcast. I'm Simar Mohanty, the team lead and student coordinator at the SDG Warriors. We're a team of passionate student changemakers and STEMness on a mission to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 by leveraging the power of STEM education and 21st century skills. Brought to you by us SDG Warriors, this podcast features inspiring stories from EDUheroes and STEM experts from around the world, ideal for students, teachers, parents, and pretty much anybody who's interested in STEM education and local impact and social impact. This podcast aims to provide enriching learning experiences and drive positive change in local, global, and digital communities. Well, usually we speak with EDUheroes, but every so often an EDUhero joins us from another dimension, the one where superheroes are made. So, in a world where heroes wear capes, suits, and symbiotes, or just carry the weight of surviving, someone has to bring their stories to life. And today, that someone is with us. We are joined by Mr. Eric Monacelli, who is the executive producer at Marvel Games and a true world builder in the gaming universe. With over 18 years of experience, Mr. Eric currently oversees production and franchise development for Marvel's biggest console titles, including Marvel's Spider-Man, Avengers, Iron Man VR, Guardians of the Galaxy, and the upcoming Marvel's Wolverine, Iron Man, and Black Panther. And as the project lead, he drives creative strategy, brand authenticity, cross-functional development, and global promotional planning across multiple high-profile franchises. And prior to that, he was at Naughty Dog, Capcom, Atari, Infinity Ward, and 2K Games, where he contributed to the most famous titles like The Last of Us, Monster Hunter, and BioShock. And today we are going to go behind the scenes into the process and the passion and the purpose of the EDUhero who helps to shape the heroes that we see on screen, the stories that we feel, and the worlds that we escape into. Well, Mr. Eric, it's an absolute honor to have you on a podcast today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and as a former educator myself, I'm just grateful for the invitation and being on the podcast.
Awesome. Well, before we dive into today's conversation, to help our listeners audibly visualize the entire experience, can you tell us where are you located, what is the weather like outside, and what can you see from your window right now?
Yeah, I'm located in New York, so outside New York City, very close to Manhattan. If I look out my window right now, it's actually bright and sunny. It's a nice day. It's a nice spring day. When I look outside, I see my backyard. I'm working from home on a Friday, and the birds are chirping. The grass is green. The flowers are blooming. It is lovely. So it's a great day.
That's a beautiful picture, Mr. Eric. And back here at home at Bangalore, India, last night there was like heavy rain, and even today Thor's hammer is creating some havoc outside. So I don't know if you can hear the lightning storms in the background, but the weather is finally cooled down. We have cloudy skies, we have a nice breeze, we have rains, and the fresh post-rain smell in the air. And yes, outside my window, I can see the damp streets. I can see a few scooters going here and there, and they're struggling to move in the water. So yes, it's a calm Friday scene. And yeah, it's the mango season. So enjoying some fresh and juicy mangoes during this season.
That's amazing. I actually had some mango this morning for breakfast, so that's a common thing. Yeah, I think we got them. I think they're from Mexico, though, the mangoes that we got. So, yeah.
Yes, I love mangoes. I always wait for summers for this very reason.
Yeah, some mangoes are delicious. They're really, really ripe and juicy and sweet this time of year, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Now that we've got now that the curtain's gone up, let's start the story from page 1. Mr. Eric, As a gallery guide at the Brooklyn Museum, you were helping people to interpret art, connecting them to stories, identity, and meaning in real time. And today you do something similar in games, but on a much larger and interactive scale. So, how did that early experience curating human connection through art shape the way that you approach storytelling in games like Miles Morales or The Last of Us? And especially when you're dealing with themes like identity, cultural history, and emotional depth.
Yeah, no, I mean, my experiences, especially, I worked as a gallery guide in my 20s at the Brooklyn Museum, and I did a lot with art. One of my very, very close friends, his name is Tommy Hartung. He's a pretty well known academic artist in the space, so I'd always been in the art world. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I was a former educator. And so bringing that knowledge and that sort of skill set of performing, educating, learning about art to, or learning about anything, right, to the art world really shaped my way of seeing. And when I was in college, I studied under Professor Flora Kaplan, and she was a museology professor, which is a fancy word for museum studies. And museum studies really just taught me some ways of seeing the world and the different objects in it. And I really took that to heart, and it applies to how I look at video games. I didn't realize that till a couple of years ago, to be honest with you, but I sort of came up with my own definition for video games, where they're this virtual space that's filled with carefully curated digital artifacts that create these fictional worlds. And, you know, when you get into these worlds, it provides an emotional feedback loop and you can derive meaning from it. And, you know, to truly get into a game world, you have to have active participation. And museums are very similar, right? Or a gallery or wherever you go look at art, where you have a real world space. It's not virtual like a video game. It has thoughtfully curated objects, but they're tend to be real world. Some are, you know, maybe digital or fictional. They do the same thing. They create this emotional feedback loop and provide meaning. And so when the viewer goes through an exhibit and sort of walks around a gallery space or museum, there becomes this feedback loop. They derive meaning, they get emotional from it. They sort of have to participate in an active way too, even though it's a little bit more passive because you're observing. But if you truly have set up a good exhibition, I think at a museum space, it requires the person viewing the art to be more active, to step past passive participation and go into active learning. And that's what, you know, I love about games and what I love about art and museums is that if you make that little bit of effort and you take that leap from that passivity into an active state of curiosity and learning, it'll open up a whole new world for you. I know for me personally, when I was a kid, I grew up in a very small rural town, very not many people around, and so I sort of dove into video games. And when I was playing Final Fantasy, I was fighting these monsters, and one of the monsters was the Kraken, and the Chimera was another monster. And I was like, "What are Krakens like Chimeras? I don't know what they are." And so I actually fought them, I beat them on the screen, and then I was like, okay, I'm gonna go learn what are these real things. And you know, lo and behold, I go into mythology and look at some of those books, and I see that they are. So I think that really shaped how I view the world and how I view things. You know, when you're laying out sort of thinking about a level in a game and then thinking about like a exhibit space you walk through in the art world, kind of the same in some ways, right? Like you want people to look at certain objects in certain ways. You know, I've been to a lot of exhibitions where it's like, here's the timeline of the artist's history from 1920 to 1980. And, you know, you got to walk through that and you want to show their evolution and their progression. And if you think about a level, could be somewhat the same if you think about it. It's a little bit of a leap, but it's kind of how my brain works and how I think about how people, you know, will process information and sort of gather thoughts together and go from passive participation to active participation. And that active participation helps create the emotional depth, help create like, oh, wow, I identify with this object. You know, another great thing, and woman Nicole Carpenter wrote this article in Polygon about it. Both The Last of Us and Marvel Spider-Man 1 and Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales, so all three of those games have museums or galleries in them of some kind. And it's interesting because if you look at those spaces, they're like sort of telling this history and lore of the past, what happened in the game world, but it also tells the history and lore of the game a little bit and the fictional character. And in Marvel Spider-Man, our first game from 2018, there's this moment when Mary Jane Watson looks at a mask in Roseman's gallery, which is named after our VP of Creative, Bill Roseman, little Easter egg, and looks at the mask and talks about like why heroes wear masks, and sort of gets into the philosophical thinking about like what that means. And it just provides a lot of character story, background, emotional depth, helps give people a sense of her character identity. Maybe you identify with that too if you see that and you're like, yeah, I'm like Mary Jane Watson. I wonder why heroes wear masks, right? And so then it also gets into the sort of the cultural history of what's happening. So wraps everything up in this really nice wrapper. And I think there's a lot of analogies between the museum world and game design and game levels. So it's my long way of saying that it's really just shaped like how I think about it holistically.
Absolutely, Mr. Eric. You put it out very thoughtfully and beautifully. And I think like in a museum, like every person, they bring their own perspective into a place of art. And like the games, like you mentioned, they work in very much the same way in both like the users or the players or the people who are visiting the museums. They have the shared responsibility to craft that story that invites connections, that allows the audience, like the museum visitors or the players, to bring their own experiences into the narrative. And what's especially powerful in games, I think, is how they strike that balance between creating a story that's universally resonant while also giving the players that space to see themselves reflected in it. And especially like when the themes of the game, they focus on identity and cultural history, it really helps the players to connect on a much more deeper level, because in games also, like, it's not that serious, right? It's a safe space to explore different things. So I think yes, games and museums, they're pretty much work in the same way.
Yeah, it's true, and I mean that's very insightful and a great way to put it. Those sort of mirror neurons that fire when you look at something and have this sort of reaction to it. I remember looking at El Greco's view of Toledo at the Met when I was in my 20s in college, and I would stare at that painting for hours, and I was like, I've never been to Europe. I don't really understand it. But as I got older and I started to travel more and I went to these places, I was like, okay, now I get why this is a beautiful painting. I get what this means. I get the significance behind it. The painting I have behind me right here, Craig Kindler painted this of Jackie Robinson. And that's a cultural moment in American history of, when a Black person broke the color barrier that was unnecessarily put in Major League Baseball, and just memorializing that and immortalizing that is something very meaningful to me. So I think that art does the same thing. Video games will demand the same thing. There's a great story when I was working on The Last of Us DLC. Last of Us Left Behind came out, and I'm going to spoil it a little bit if you haven't played it, but there's a moment where Ellie, the main character, actually has a kiss with Riley, one of the other characters. And we got this letter from a fan who witnessed that moment. Her name was Keely. And Keely was like, I was very nervous about coming out to my parents. I was very nervous about being who I was, but I saw Ellie kiss Riley on screen, and it gave me the courage to tell my parents what was going on. And that sort of moment, those sort of emotional resonances that you can get from gaming, that's beautiful. You can't ask for anything better from art, and I love that sort of thing. And I think that's a very clear example of how powerful gaming can be.
Absolutely. It all comes down to building those human connections and those deep emotional depths that the games they dive into. And speaking of human connections, Mr. Eric, as part of Columbia's pre-med program, you were published in Primary Psychiatry on PMS dysphoric disorder, a topic which is rooted in complexity, empathy, and clinical analysis. So how did that complexity and that kind of scientific research and writing shape the way that you now approach emotionally grounded characters?
Yeah, scientific research and the rigors behind it, the amount of testing and retesting and iteration and the loops you go through to prove that your hypothesis and your thesis is correct is something that's always been very impactful to me and important. And I think that's important for creating characters, is you have to test that character. You have to have it hold metal. You have to have it hold weight. we're full of contradictions. Our characters are full of contradictions, but if you're gonna have sort of these contradictions in these characters, you have to have core principles and values that they abide by, and those are sort of almost, the scientific, if you want to say like your hypothesis is like, this is what the character should behave like, and then you test it against how they interact with things. So I apply that in a way. My brother's a scientist for NASA JPL, and so I grew up with him, and he's helped shape my imagination in a lot of ways. He's very scientific, like exceptionally scientific, and sort of understanding the psychological state of what it takes to get in that mindset of like, you're narrowed in on trying to figure out exactly what's going on using the scientific method. Psychology and psychological states are a big thing that I think about with characters, with consumers even too, because understanding the psychology of a player and the emotional states that are brought out when people are playing games, that's essential to designing a good game. And then it's also essential to good marketing, because when you're marketing a game, you want to talk about like, hey, this game is going to make you feel joy or sad. Like you want people to connect with the moments of what it is. You don't always explicitly state that, but you want to get at that emotional response in some meaningful way. And that's all rooted in sort of understanding the psychiatry or psychology behind it. And I did go to Columbia. I wanted to be a psychiatrist. I actually ended up dropping out, but this is how I ended up in video games. But, I think that's always been an interest for me, the whole sort of psychological and psychiatric states of people, and how they think about life, but also when they're playing games.
Absolutely. And research, it teaches us so much about discipline and empathy as well. Like, for example, when you're writing a research paper, especially in a subject like psychology, you really need to empathize and understand someone's lived experience before you can tell that person's story authentically. And especially like when you're writing about a disorder, it's like more than just presenting words or data or numbers and facts. It's also about listening to their voices and translating them honestly. And I think that level of empathetic communication, we can see that in lots of games, like in The Last of Us, like Ellie's trauma, and like in Miles, his coming of age struggles. And all of this, it's rooted in psychology. And again, when you're talking about marketing as well, psychology plays a pretty big role. So yes.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I mean, to get at the article that I helped co-author on PMS Forest Coder, I worked closely with a professor at University of Buffalo, and he had all this research done, and he was like, I don't know how to make this digestible and actually readable for this journal. And he basically gave me the research, and he's like, you're a good writer. I think you can tell it in such a way that actually would get me published. And so I took all the data, I took all the sort of findings he had, and I made it into a story of sorts, right? And that's was my main job for him. And yeah, when you're reading through a lot of the findings of things like that, especially with disorders, it is very personal. It is very often subjective. Like the scientific method is important, but there is a lot of, like you say, empathy and also just rigor applied in a way that you can't purely test in a like if A then B way. It's more of like, okay, this result happened and these are the outcomes, and this could be one potential direction, and how do you process that, and what you do to actually combat some of the dysphoria and that sort of thing. And that was sort of how I positioned it, and really leaned into the different ways you could try to objectively solve some of the dysphoria around the disorder. And unfortunately, that journal went offline, but I still have the hard copy somewhere. And it was really an interesting project to work on, especially early in my sort of journey.
Absolutely. And that's the power of storytelling, that something so complex as scientific research, if you apply storytelling principles in that, you can actually make it digestible for people who need to read that very paper. It's not like you're just putting out facts. Like, you need to simplify them so that you can tailor them to your audience, the people who are reading it.
Yeah, and that was my sorry to cut you off, but that was my finding. I was just like, I I had gone into the research knowing, a little bit. I'm certainly not a woman. I'm certainly never have dealt with PMS dysphoric disorder. So I took it from the perspective of like, how can I understand what these people are going through, and getting all this different information and sort of synthesizing it in a way like, these are their stories. This is what may help you. Let's go. Let's talk through this. Right. And so that's the approach I took.
Absolutely. And building on that blend of empathy and analysis, Mr. Eric, students often visualize career success as a straight and strategic climb where every move is like carefully planned. But
Yeah.
sometimes growth comes from trusting your gut or stepping back to move forward. So, like, can you share a moment when ignoring the smart plan or taking a step back, even when it seems super risky, ended up in unlocking something bigger in your story?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm the poster child for this. My career has sort of been a windy path. I initially didn't go to college right away. I thought I would be a musician, and I tried to play in bands and travel around the country. That worked out not at all. I got as far as Cleveland, so it wasn't a very far from my hometown. It was about like a 3-hour drive. Played a couple shows, was working some odd jobs at factories and hardware stores and things like that. And then I realized at a certain point, I was just like, all right, if I'm ever going to break out of where I'm at and get into a career that's meaningful for me and interesting with me, I got to just take the risk and move. And so I applied to transfer. I was going to SUNY school. I had dropped out of that. I applied to transfer into NYU. And to get into that college, I had a decent SATs and everything, and I did well in school, but I wasn't exceptional because I kind of hated school. I always liked learning, from the street smart level and just with talking with people. And I wrote a letter directly to the dean of the English department, and I had always been good at storytelling and writing. And he was like, "Yeah, this is a great letter. I understand where you're coming from. Come here." And so I got to transfer in, and that was a huge risk to leave this small little bubble protective hometown I had that was very safe, to journey to the big city and live in New York. I did that. And then, I took so many, if I go through my whole life story, it'll be too much, but I've moved across the country in the United States like 3 or 4 times. It's taking those risks and sort of like knowing where to follow career trajectories and pathways has always been an important thing for me. And, you take a step back, you look at it and you're like, okay, cool. If I want a career in video games, I can't live in New York right now. I need to go move to California. So I did that. If I want to have, the life that I like to live, I need to move back to New York, right? So I've done that a couple times. So, I tried to be a psychiatrist, and I realized like, okay, I would love doing this. And I still, sometimes I'm like, that would have been a fun career. But, thinking about the massive amount of debt you get in to go to study to be a doctor and that sort of thing, especially in the United States, I was like, I'm not sure if I want to do that. And, dropping out of Columbia and then, kind of just floating around and taking the risk of, I found an internship that connected me in the games industry, and that started my whole career in games. And so, yeah, sometimes you just got to take those choices, trust your gut, and know where it's going. It's not always clear, and you got to just walk through the fog or the void or whatever you want to call it, and get to the other side and see where you go, and then branch from there.
Absolutely, Mr. Eric, and that really hits home. Like many students, they assume that success is like a straight line. You need to do this, then you need to do this, and like everything is cause and effect, everything is pre-planned. It's just like you need to do this, that's it. But like your example shows that the richest growth, it often comes from when we veer off the safe path and we
Yes.
embrace uncertainty. And trusting yourself in those kind of moments, it can feel pretty scary and daunting, but many a times when we take these risks, obviously consciously and after weighing all the parameters and looking at what place we are in, it can unlock the most powerful breakthroughs, in my opinion. And like this reminds me of a quote that our first ever EDUhero on this podcast had said, Miss Kathy Koznowski, leap and the net will appear.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, no, that's a very good quote. I sort of abide by the idea of like, the idea of having a safety net is always a little strange for me. Some people are born into safety nets and can just fall back into things. For me, it's always just been taking a risk, seeing where it goes, and then finding, my whole career has sort of been filled on jumping into these situations and realizing like, okay, there is a need for this particular thing here. I am going to figure out how to teach myself how to do this thing. And, the best example I have of that is when I first got hired at 2K Games, which was my first job in the industry. They hired me as a marketing coordinator, which they didn't really know what I wanted to do. They just needed somebody to help with marketing. And then I realized when I was working there that they had nobody to edit trailers. They had nobody who was a video editor and to work on stuff. So I actually taught myself how to edit video, and I ended up creating a lot of the trailers for BioShock and a lot of the behind the scenes for that game. And that sort of helped launch my career and really get into a lot of it. And it also helped me understand the games industry a lot because I got to interview all these game developers and understand what they were doing. So take the leap and you'll find what you need, and also be willing to have, the grit and determination to push yourself in a direction that may make yourself uncomfortable, but will ultimately help your growth.
Absolutely. It's all about stepping outside of your comfort zone and, embracing new processes. And talking about processes, we know that process matters, but a lot of times it's invisible. So, Mr. Eric, can you describe how has your personal process evolved from your first ship title, BioShock, to now leading Marvel's AAA titles?
Yeah, I think, my career trajectory, when I first got into gaming, I'll get into this probably a little later about how gaming was viewed when I was growing up, because it wasn't viewed as the most positive thing. But, I got into gaming with the idea of like, hey, you have to love games and you work on game. If you're going to be in the games industry, all you do is play games day in and day out. That is the furthest thing from the truth. Playing games is definitely part of the job, but, as my career has gone along, I honestly play more games, less hours than I used to, right? Like I would play games all the time and I would play certain games over and over again. But, I think the biggest thing for my personal process is I draw from as many sources as I can. And I learned that is honestly what creates the best video games, because sort of getting back to what we first talked about is we're in the business of building out these fictional virtual worlds full of these digital artifacts, right? And you have to observe stuff in the real world and translate that into this digital world. And when you're doing that, pulling from all these different sources helps make it real, make it authentic. If you're just focused, you're like, I am the best Call of Duty, I am the best World of Warcraft, I am the best Fortnite player ever, you're pretty narrow, right? That's a narrow way of looking. And maybe that'll help if you want to be like a professional Fortnite player or streamer or something. But if you're going to work in gaming and you're going to work on different worlds and help build and storytell, you need to draw from all sorts of inspiration and sources. So I think that's what has evolved the most. I used to be very, very sort of narrow and like, okay, cool, games are all I care about. This is all and I do care about games deeply, but I've realized that looking at other things, looking at the world in a holistic way and bringing those learning to video games actually helps make better games.
Absolutely. It's all about embracing those multiple perspectives and keeping your mind open, having an open mindset, having a growth mindset. If you have like a closed one where you think that you're the best at everything you do, of course, you can't learn anything. And the world is a really big place. There are lots of things that you can learn. There's lots of things that you can experiment with. And that eventually helps you to evolve into a better person, into a better human being who can use their own superpowers for good.
Yes.
And yes. So speaking about evolution, every project has its own storms. So from the outside, blockbuster games like Marvel Spider-Man, they look like flawless masterpieces. But students like us, we rarely hear about the unpredictable and the exhausting middle where things don't go according to the plan. So we were curious to know, what does the messy middle of AAA game production look like? And can you share a behind the scenes creative battle or breakdown moment that forced you to improvise or adapt or rethink everything to protect the heart of the project?
Yeah. I mean, the best way to sum it up in simple terms is it looks like doubt and it looks like fear, right? Those are the things that start to get at you as you're helping, build out these worlds and working with the thousands of people that make these games, right? Especially AAA production, like the idea that one single person created anything is erroneous, right? Like it is so many people involved. There are so many just touch points from all over, and it all sort of just magically creates this game. And sometimes it's insane that games even get made because of how complex they are. And I think towards the middle, and this is every project I've worked on, you sort of go through this like, okay, cool. What's the idea? You go through the idea, like, okay, this is bad, this is good, blah, right? You go through all this stuff. And then you get to this point where you're like, okay, this is good, we're going, you're moving along, you're going in production. And then all of a sudden, you hit a wall and it's like, okay, is this good? I don't know. Like, I'm afraid. Right? And you start to do some testing. You get it out there. Then you got to sort of let it go, do player testing, get some insights, consumer research, and that sort of thing. And there's always that moment when you're afraid that a game won't be any good. And I think that is what happens in the middle a lot. And I think, this player feedback becomes essential at that point, like getting some feedback around the creative vision you're shaping, but you can't over rely on that, because sometimes, you test 16 people and it's just 16 people, right? It's not enough people to really get a good sample. As we know from scientific research, you need enough people that have the right sample size. So at a certain point, you get those data points and you see where things are sliding, and then you just got to trust your gut. You're like, okay, this is a little low, let's amp up this section, and that sort of thing. And I think, there are multiple stories throughout my career where I've sort of had to improvise and rethink and adapt and just sort of get to the heart of what the creative vision is. But, it's always through working and collaborating closely with the developers and what they're doing. I think, for me, a personal thing that I'll share from my past career is, I'm very close to one of the Capcom brands, Okami, and I was a product manager on Okami then, which was sort of the spiritual successor to Okami. And that game was a very tiny game. It didn't have a huge budget to begin with, and then there was a moment for marketing it. And there was a moment when I got approached by my boss, and they're like, hey, we know you don't have a huge budget, but we're going to have to cut it even more just because it'll help us. And so it was almost slashed in half. And so I had to rethink and how I approach sort of marketing and promoting it and protect like what was great about it to sort of hit, appropriate goals and things like that. And so I was like, where are people living? What's the most authentic way to talk about this? And at the time, this was like 2008, 2009, Facebook was very popular. There was a very active social community around Okami. And so I really engaged with that community, and I talked to them. I listened to them. I invited them in. I did contests and stories, and we just had a great community building experience. And doing that and then rethinking about like how I was going to roll out the marketing, I was like, okay, I'm going to take this mostly digital. At the time, like print was still kind of relevant. I was like, all right, print's not really worth it. Take it mostly digital, lean into the community, lean into this, which I leaned into another thing. There was a meme going around 3 wolves howling at the moon. And it was on a t-shirt, right? And The Office made it really popular, the show. And Okami, there's actually 3 wolves. They're the incarnation of Japanese sun gods, but they're it's a sun thing. So I was like, let's do a 3 wolves howling at the sun t-shirt. And I did that t-shirt, and it became, I had to explain the joke to the production team over in Japan a lot. I think it took me, I remember it was 52 emails and like 3 video calls to even explain the joke, because it was like, it was culturally hard to get across. And once I did, I put the t-shirt out, and it had sort of like a viral pop where everybody was like, oh, this is a play off the meme. And, that sort of thing really protected and really got at like, what I was trying to do was create this groundswell of community support. And it showed in the results, even though my budget was cut, even though we struggled with a lot of being able to do the production and all the grand plans I had. We were still able to succeed our sales goal by, a very good percentage. I can't say publicly, but it was over 100%. And that was awesome, right? Like that really made me feel like cool, like that, I wouldn't say it was more of a, because of the size of the game, it was a little bit smaller, but it was treated like a AAA because Okami was so big. So, but I really struggled with that, and I was very happy with the outcome of where we got.
And that absolutely sounds intense, Mr. Eric. And honestly, it reminds me of the frantic and the creative firefights that we have behind the scenes while putting together this very podcast, especially like when we are all personally pitching our questions and we hope that ours make the final cut. But again, like just like you mentioned in game development, those high pressure and collaborative moments, that is the place where real magic that takes shape. And like we merge, for example, like we merge lots of questions sometimes to help accommodate people. And it's like a really good reminder for all of us that, every polished moment that we see on screen, every shiny pearl that we see or we hear in a podcast, everything, it comes from a place of grit, it comes from a place of compromise and a whole lot of creative heart. And like just like Miles and Peter, they teamed up. Game development is, like you mentioned, more about a shared purpose. It's about mutual trust and also building something greater together. So
Yeah,
yes.
being greater together and collaborating. And, I think another one that I'll just say high level is like, if you've heard any music in any video game trailer ever, those are always the biggest fights across everything, because everybody's got to, music is very subjective, right? Like what you like and how it works and how it fits. So, I remember some songs, and you'd propose a song, or you'd be like, okay, this would be great in this moment. And they're like, nah. And so you always have to have those conversations. So that's another thing that comes up. I mean, there's a lot of other creative tensions and things that I could get into, but it is always like that. Yeah, that's a good analogy.
And like emerging from all that chaos, Mr. Eric, you've helped define icons like Peter Parker, Miles Morales, Joel, and even Nathaniel Drake. So, what do you think defines a hero and across all of these universes? And have you ever disagreed with how one was being written or portrayed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a big part of my job, is to make sure that our characters are authentically portrayed and written. And if we do disagree, or my creative team and I are sort of like, oh, this isn't really right for how this character is portrayed, we will raise that. We will have the conversations with the developers who are creating it. So that happens all the time, for sure. And I think getting back to the definition, what we're always looking for, we have these pillars and sort of what we always look for in terms of the Marvel brand. And I think a lot of them are relatable across the board, but, relatability, complexity, intensity, levity, heroic purpose, right? These sort of things, having layers of intention and purpose, that's a thing that really makes a hero. But ultimately, at the end of the day, heroes are defined by their humanity. And that's really what it comes down to. So getting into the human characteristics of a hero, getting into sort of that juxtaposition between what it's like when they have the mask on versus mask off. I think that's really what's made Marvel as successful as it is. Also, Marvel as a brand has been successful because it's a very fluid brand. It adapts to the times, it changes with the times. And so, you see that, and sometimes you even disagree. Like, a person has in their mind, they grew up with Captain America from the 1970s, and it's like, oh no, it's 2025 now. What would Captain America be like in 2025? You have to adapt, right? You have to change, that sort of thing. So I think that's really what defines a hero, is making it relatable, making it complex, but giving it layers and making it human.
Absolutely. Humanness and relatability, that's a really powerful way to define a hero. And it reminds me of something that we study in math. Like, whenever we talk about limits, we always say that it's approaching infinity. We know that it's never about reaching infinity, but about constantly getting closer. And I sort of relate with it with perfection, that it's not the destination, but the effort that matters. And in the same way, like you put together, Mr. Eric, heroism is not about, always being flawless and shiny. It's about showing up, especially when things are super messy and they're super uncertain. And like the personally, the heroes that I connect with, they are the ones who are most flawed, they are the most vulnerable. But the thing is that they still keep showing up, because in reality, that is what makes us original, that is what makes us human. So yes,
Yeah.
humanity at the center.
Yeah, no, it's that striving for to uphold your values, right? Like that's a big thing. You strive and you want to make sure, even when you're faced with the choice and you don't take the way out that might be the easier way, you stick to your values and you live by those. And I think a lot of heroes are defined by those actions, and that's really what matters.
Absolutely. And speaking of this human core and originality, managing iconic franchises, that means balancing audience expectations, production realities, and even emotional truth, all while keeping these characters human. And sometimes, like with Guardians of the Galaxy, the boldest narrative choices, they become the most celebrated. So, Mr. Eric, how do you personally decide when to protect a creative idea or character moment at all costs versus when to compromise for production or branding? And can you share a time when taking a narrative risk paid off in a way that made the story more emotionally powerful or unforgettable?
Yeah, I think it's really the great development partners we work with. Everyone from Insomniac Games to NetEase to Kabam to like all the different teams we work with have these amazing writers and amazing storytellers and creative directors that we really just want to get their creative vision out. We help them usher that in. I'm speaking purely from my Marvel experience here. And there's certain creative directors and people I talk to every day that really just get it. They understand it. They want to sort of communicate what these heroes are about, what these characters are about. So it's a matter of sort of like holding true to those core pillars that I spoke to in the last question: the relatability, the complexity, the levity, the heroic purpose, that sort of thing, but also adapting it to creative vision, taking the necessary risks that are I like to say it, and I borrowed this from an industrial designer. His name's Raymond Lowry. He said that he's a very popular industrial designer. He used to have the saying, it was Maya, and it was most advanced yet acceptable. And I liked it, but I was like, things don't have to be really acceptable in games. They need to be spectacular. They need to be memorable. They need to really hit you. So I sort of rephrase it to make advanced yet approachable, or make advanced yet accessible. And so when you make something advanced and you make it approachable, you're like, I see the kernel of it. I see the familiarity there, but you've advanced it to the point where like, this is fresh, unique, new, exciting, original. And when you make it accessible, it's the same thing, right? So I think that's part of it. A really good example of this is, when we were working on Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales, the villain in the story was the Tinkerer. If you know the history of the Tinkerer, it's traditionally an old white man who tinkers and sort of like creates robots and different things. The team at Insomniac came to us who like, it's cool, but having an old white dude and tinkering in his basement and not like super powerful and able to fight with a hero and keep up on the level might not be that exciting. How would you feel if we changed this and made it more personal, leaned into the human drama, the soap opera qualities that Marvel has, where we made it one of Miles's friends, and maybe made, instead of a guy, we made it into a girl, and it's a person of color. And so that's how we ended up with the Tinkerer and Miles Morales being portrayed by Jasmine Savoy Brown, who was a Black actress. And so that little change just made it more personal, more on the level, more I think authentic to what Miles Morales would probably face in 2025 versus if he was facing a Tinkerer from a while ago. So that was a creative risk, but I think it made the story more emotionally powerful and unforgettable, and people related to it.
Absolutely. Make it advanced and make it approachable. And I think it's quite similar to the stuff that goes behind building our podcast. We could like easily follow the standard script, stick to the questions that everybody expects, those old school ones. But like sometimes we choose to dig deeper into the conversations that matter, because again, those are the things which make us all human. Those are the things which resonates with our audience, because at those moments of honesty and vulnerability, that is what connects with people the most, and that is when they're most open to learning. And it's that same balance that he spoke about, staying true to the heart of your values about what matters, even if it means stepping off of the beaten path.
Yes, absolutely.
And speaking of emotional truth, The Last of Us, it went from a PlayStation game to a globally acclaimed HBO series. And as someone who has helped shape the original game's voice at Naughty Dog, how did it feel to see it evolve into a show? And did it stay true to what you helped build?
Yeah, I mean, I worked in sort of the development side, and I was very closely with all the developers day to day with Bruce Straley and Neil Druckmann and the 1,000 other people that worked on the game. And I think that, seeing it evolve and what I did to help shape the community around The Last of Us, and then it become this juggernaut on HBO and people love it. I always laugh when people are like surprised by what happened in the show, because I was like, if you played the game, you would already know, like especially the moment that happened last Sunday. But it was one of these things where it's just been really remarkable and rewarding, and the thousands of people that created it and really deserve all the credit for that, especially Bruce and Neil and Evan and all Christoph and all those folks that worked on it. But I think one of the stories a couple things. I was actually going around USC campus trying to collect signatures for a kidney dialysis bill with my ex-wife, and we were sort of collecting these signatures, and I walked up to this guy. I was like, would you sign this form to get the bill put onto the ballot? And he sat down, and we were just talking while he was signing, and it turned out he was a journalist for the LA Times that would go cover like war. He would go over to like wherever war was happening, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Russia, wherever, right? And he would like be a war reporter. And I was like, well, that's a crazy job. I've never talked to someone like you. What's that like? And he's like, it's hard, but like I've always loved being in this intense action. And he's like, what do you do? And I was like, I work in video games. I worked on The Last of Us. And he was like, oh my God, The Last of Us. I love that game. And I was like, how did this, like that realization that I could connect with somebody who was, a war reporter, and it meant something to her. It had a really profound impact on me. And it's just like, okay, cool. We're telling these stories, all of us collectively, is shaped that way. And then when I watched the show, the show kicks off, and they did a very, very smart thing where in the game, the action takes place. The game launched in 2013, the first game, and the action sort of when the pandemic, I think it's 10 or 20 years later. I can't remember which. So it's either 2033 or 2023 where the main action of the game takes place. But in the show, the pandemic starts in 2023. So they sped it up about a decade. It corresponded perfectly to what we were all going through with COVID, right? Like it was that sort of, so like when you watch the show, you're like, oh man, there's an outbreak and it's cordyceps and there's a fungus that's going to invade the whole world. It's 2023. I'm watching the show, and I think it launched in 24 or something around there. And it's just like you related to it instantly because we were all living through that moment. And so that's another thing that I was like, all right, that was a smart move by Craig Mazin and all the HBO people to make it into that show in that way, because it really frames it in a moment in our cultural history, in our moment in time where we're all sort of afraid of a pandemic happening. And this is a show about a pandemic happening. Here's what could happen. And so it really makes you lean into it. So seeing the slight differences between the game, I think episode 3 of season 1, the one that Craig Mazin wrote, is one of the greatest side stories and a beautiful, beautiful episode of television. The love story of Bill and his partner, and I think that sort of stuff really, really is great. I honestly, I'll be honest, I haven't watched much beyond that episode because when I saw the end of that episode, it's like the window with the curtain blowing, and I was like, this is when the game starts, because if you start up the game, that's the start screen from the game. And I was like, I already worked on the game. I know what happens next. I'm not going to watch anymore, right? And so, it was that visual cue, that thing that you see, and so. And it's a tough show for me. Like I really, apocalypse narratives are hard. I really want narratives that sort of move beyond that and are more about like healing through self-care and self, coming together in unity, where a lot of the narrative of The Last of Us is like, hey, if we keep doing this, we're just going to keep destroying each other, right? It's like, so that's just the struggle that I have with some of where that's gone. But it is interesting to see. I love a lot of the works they've done. Kudos and hats off to everybody there. I'd love what they've done.
And again, like this ties to adaptability, like you mentioned, not only heroes who are adapting constantly, like Captain America, how would he be in 2025, but also franchises like The Last of Us, you know, adapting it to like, how the world looks like today. And seeing your characters, how they leap from the controller to the screen, it also tells us a lot about the power of, strong narrative design, because it's storytelling which transcends the medium. And when your work is being adapted so beautifully, you don't just see it through the lens of a creator, a person who has worked on a game, but also like a relative who is witnessing the emotional DNA of your creation as it grows through those new interpretations. And while most of the adaptations, I think they tend to shift or lose something along the way, I think this one clearly honored the heart of what you originally built, Mr. Eric.
Yeah, no, I mean, let's be clear what thousands of people built. I give a lot of credit to Bruce Straley, Neil Druckmann. Those two people were the driving force behind a lot of the original Last of Us, especially Bruce. Neil wrote a lot of it, and Bruce came up with the idea for the Cordyceps stuff. So, like, those folks build a lot. I was just part of the community. My biggest contribution, I would say, is I was just like, when we did the Firefly pendants, I was like, yo, we should reach out to the community and we should get some names from the community on the pendants. So when people play the game, we could have 20 evangelists that already know, like, oh my God, my name is in the game. So I worked with a lot of the community to make that happen. And so, that was sort of part of the storytelling I was doing, is just really, really connecting it back to the community. And I think that's always important with everything you're doing, in storytelling, is just making it personal for people and connecting it back. So, again, hats off to the thousands of people that worked on it and the success it's had. And, I love PlayStation Productions and what Assad and Carter and Evan and all those executive producers on the series have done.
A huge shout out and a big thank you to all those people who make these superheroes, who make these worlds come to life for all of us. And yes, teamwork does make the dream work. And since, Mr. Eric, you have seen both directions now, how games inspire screen stories, like in The Last of Us, and how screen characters, they inspire games, like in Miles Morales. From a creative production standpoint, which direction is harder to get right and why?
I would say neither is harder. They're both difficult, right? It's really just a matter of having a clear vision and story, and then collaborating with the creative teams that shape the story. I think Miles Morales too, he came from the comics, right? And so like there was a whole history of Miles from the comics that we brought to the game. Peter Parker, 60, 70 years now almost of Peter Parker stories out there. How do you make it original? John Paquette and Brian Intihar and Jacinda Chu and all the people at Insomniac were like, yo, this is how we want to tell a Peter Parker story. They worked with the thousands of people on their team to make it more interesting than I've ever read a Peter Parker story. And I would argue it's my favorite Peter Parker story because of their vision, right? And we helped them bring that to life. And so I think I wouldn't say it's harder in any direction. It's always difficult. You always have to get into what sort of pillars you want to tell, what sort of themes, like how do you make it, again, how do you make it advanced yet approachable? How do you make it accessible to people? How do you change it in such a way that's fresh and relevant to the cultural moment and the time period you're in? And, these awesome collaborators that I have the fortune of working with have some great ideas around that. And, I just help them make that happen.
And I think it's a lot about not retelling the same story again and again, but it's about how you're reshaping how people connect with it. Like in games, we feel the story through our choices, but like when we are seeing shows, we experience emotion by watching how the characters navigate it. And that actually reminds me of the Harry Potter series. Like the
Yeah.
books, they let each of us, they imagine how Hogwarts looks like in our own way, and then the films, they gave us like a shared and a more grand and emotional experience. And then later, when the video games came out, like Harry Potter's Hogwarts Legacy, it places us directly into that world. It helps us to carve our own path and choose our own spells. So when all of these things come together into one franchise, I think it makes the game more, the entire narrative more accessible to all sorts of players, all sorts of people who want to experience that story. So
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. And if you keep it core to the authenticity of those characters, right? Like all those like I have never read the Harry Potter books, but I've watched all the movies and I love the movies. My girlfriend's trying really hard to get me to read the books. I will at some point. But the reality is, like, I have, wherever you approach something, and my favorite films are actually, most of my favorite films are based on books or something like that. And I'll sometimes go back and forth between the two, and I'll realize, like, oh, cool, this is a very awesome way, and I understand what they needed to adapt to make the film work versus the book work. And there are creative changes, but it keeps true to the vision. It keeps true to the authenticity of the characters. It keeps true to the themes and the moments and the values that the characters sort of espouse and get out to people. And I think that's really what makes it work.
Absolutely. And that point does make me wonder that when interactivity that meets narrative, new kinds of emotional truths, they emerge. So Mr. Eric, do you think we feel stories more deeply when we control them in games or when we surrender to them in films? And most importantly, how do you personally make sense of that difference as a creator?
I mean, I think emotions are really individual and unique to each person, right? Like your capability and capacity for emotion varies from people to people, like person to person. So whatever moves your soul will move it, right? Like if you have a certain thing that stirs you, if you've gone through a certain process that stirs you, it moves you. And I think, talking about movies which tend to be more passive and video games which tend to be more active is interesting. I think as humans, we're inclined to prefer passive engagement simply because it's easier, right? So that's why film, television, music, things that you can just leave on in the background are a little bit easier. Video games challenge you. You have to push harder. You have to lean into it. And so one thing I think about is, like, it's kind of like the dad who tells their kid the bedtime story as they drift off to sleep, right? Like they're like, tell me a story, tell me a story, tell them a story. And the purpose of that story is to fall asleep. So if you actively want to engage with the story being told, you have to put intentional thought and intentional motivation into it. Like the idea of the bedtime story is like, it puts me to sleep. If you want to learn something, tell me a story. I want to go learn something. You have to make that choice. So I think, active participation requires a little bit more from the participant, obviously. But I do think, as I said a while ago, sometimes there'll be moments in film or television or these passive mediums that really spur you to be active, right? So I just watched Sinners 3 times in IMAX. I love the film, might be my favorite film ever. I was watching it and I was like, what was the South like during this time? This is a fictional world, but, just learning the cultural differences down there, a little bit about the Asian population and migration down in the South. I had known nothing. And so I really dug into a little bit of the background because of that film. And so something that was a passive watching experience made me become an active learner. And that's really where I think storytelling becomes powerful. And then the emotional depth of something, like I said, it's unique. It's whatever moves your soul. There's moments like, being a former musician and just listening to some of the songs in Sinners, I'm just like, wow, I would get chills every time there's a scene in the middle of the film in a juke joint that just gives me chills every single time. And so I think emotions will always be individual to person. I remember some films I've watched where people and actors will say a line and you hear half the audience laugh and you hear the other half of the audience cry, right? Like there's different responses that you can have to the same things. And so I think if you're moving somebody and you're trying to move somebody, that's really what matters. And if you can get somebody to take that next step and be curious and intellectually thoughtful and sort of engage in a way that goes beyond the work of art, that's when it really has a deep, meaningful impact.
That hit the core, Mr. Eric, and the insight that you talked about, player agency versus passive drama, that really does tie back to even our previous question, where how each and every adaptation, it comes with its own set of challenges. And I think there's like a difference between watching a movie where, like, for example, a character makes a tough moral choice, and then later when you're playing a choose your own adventure story, okay, you are that particular character who's facing that very decision. And in the film, you observe, you comment, and you think that you can do better. But then in the other, your action, it makes the meaning of that moment, difficulties and consequences, it all makes it feel super personal. And I think that's the unique power that games have. And while these emotional choices, they are like super powerful, many of them are also layered in combat, which brings me to something that students and educators have been discussing a lot lately, that there's a growing conversation about how repeated exposure to simulated violence might slowly desensitize players to real world conflict and suffering. So how do you personally reconcile creating games where combat is central with your desire to champion empathy, resilience, and ethical growth, ensuring that players walk away with a sense of humanity as much as excitement?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because this was a conversation that it originally prevented me from joining the industry right away. Like in 2001, 2000, around that time, I believe there was a senator that called GTA a murder simulator, right? And, there were all this negativity around games. The idea that if you were a gamer, you were just a nerd trapped in your basement and it was like an addiction and it wasn't social and that sort of thing. And so, I think that's an interesting challenge. And I've worked on a lot of games that are very violent. I've worked on games that have had some moments in them where I was like, wow, that's really intense. And I think there's some empathy that is learned from experiencing those moments on the sticks, playing that way, and then going, another direction. I will personally admit, I didn't work too much directly on Last of Us 2, but there's a moment in Last of Us 2 where you have to fight dogs. I am the biggest dog lover possibly on earth. I love all dogs, any dogs. And, there's a moment where dogs are something that it's really hard to get by them. You can sneak around them, but you got to be very good at video games, which I'm only pretty good. I'm not great. And so, there's a moment I was like, I don't want to hurt a dog. I just don't. I don't like it and that sort of thing. So what I did is I actually got outside of myself. I was like, it's a video game. I'm just going to let the character walk into this dog, die a few times so I understand what's happening, so I don't feel that pain when I actually have to put the dog down to progress. And so I did that. I let Ellie just get killed like 5 times by a dog. And I was like, this is a game. Just realize that it's a game. Me hurting this digital character, it is showing the stakes of the world. It is showing how critical survival is. And I think that's the one thing that we try and do all the time. And we have these conversations about violence with purpose, right? Like, what is the purpose of the violence in the game? You can't, if you have a character that's just senseless violence, typically they're a villain, right? They're one that you're trying to take down. If you have these other characters that are, being very violent, maybe they're just trying to survive in this world you've created. And you always got to keep that framework. And I think, if a person can't make the separation between a video game and the sort of fictional consequences and the real world consequences, that could be signs of a bigger mental issue, right? Like, it's like looking at art and looking at, brutal art. And there are a lot of works of art out there that depict war or some sort of combat and thinking like, yeah, this is the way it is, right? No, you learn from it. You learn the relevant. You know what the snapshot is. You know what that sort of the impact of that moment is. But you're meant to process it and think of it in a meaningful way and in an ethical way. And it sort of gets back to, I think all games at the end of the day are wish fulfillments. That's the idea that I took from Tim Schafer, the president of Double Fine. He gave this great GDC talk about that a while ago. And so, some people, personally for me, some people have wanted to be, live out this fantasy where they have these cars and can go on driving speeds and escape the cops and GTA, right? Like that's never been a fantasy of mine, but I get the appeal. I get the appeal why people do it. And if you can do it in a safe space that is a video game, then maybe it doesn't manifest in the real world, right? Or, in a lot of ways, you can get out those urges and have those wish fulfilled in a safer space. And so that's one way, but I think as a developer and as a creator and as somebody who works on games and thinks about this a lot, I always try and be very conscious about like, all right, will this just be unnecessarily, like, will this violence be, like, how can we make this mean something? How can we make the show like there are consequences to this, right? And so, that's always been a goal of mine, and I think something that everybody I work with thinks about too, and it's an important thing. And I think over time, especially if you look at the stylization of games too, right? Like Fortnite's a great example. It's very cartoonish, right? Like it's meant to be a little cartoony. And so like removing that from the real world setting and that sort of thing. And it's just like, okay, these are pixels on a screen. They're pixels. Even thinking about like, we'll have conversations about, all right, when your character kills an enemy, how does it dissolve? How does it look? Like, how does the death sequence? We don't want it to be portrayed too gruesomely. We want it to be accurate to, what the story we're trying to tell on. So we're conscious of all this. And I think, we always want to champion empathy, resilience, and ethical approaches to violence.
That's very well said, Mr. Eric. And I think it's a big takeaway for our audience today. I think that games, they do offer like an outlet, a unique outlet to process a lot of complex emotions like, combat and conflict. They are often the backdrop for personal growth. And like, it's just like how we vent and express frustrations in a safe environment. And over here, the safe environment is the game. It's about finding that balance between letting players to engage with challenging situations while also encouraging them to reflect on the consequences of their actions, like you mentioned, Mr. Eric, like how that makes the experience meaningful. But it's always important, and I think it's the responsibility of each and every gamer, each and every player, to differentiate between the real and the real world. Just like we learn from a character's journey in the game, we must also be aware about how those experiences, they shape perceptions of how the world about the world around us. And like games, like you mentioned, they can inspire empathy and resilience, but again, it depends only if we ensure that we can understand the impact of violence, not just in game, but how it also influences their understanding of real world struggles. So yes.
Yeah, and games are a form of play, right? And we've done play forever. I mean, wrestling, the gladiatorial arena was a form of play, and that's very violent places, right? Like if you think about through the history of time, right? And so I think, I have friends now, they're like, oh, I'm upset, I'm going to go boxing. And I'm like, great, cool, that'll work for you, right? But what if you're injured right now and you can't box? You can maybe jump into a boxing video game and get some of those out, so some of those feelings don't manifest. So, I think if you have a healthy, stable mental, emotional state, like you can get into games, understand they're a safe space to get out some of those frustrations. Potentially, it's an escapism tool, and also know that the developers are thinking about how to treat this with sort of empathy and resilience, and showing that like there are consequences to actions. Violence does lead to either problems or more violence or narrative, and ultimately we're a storytelling medium, so the violence has purpose. There's intention behind it.
Absolutely. And when we are speaking about real world problems, digital first games reduce packaging waste, but production still has a footprint. So Mr. Eric, how do you think that game studios can become more environmentally conscious, especially during multi-year resource heavy production cycles?
Yeah, I mean, I believe we're seeing it. Like companies are shifting to working remotely and hybrid and having, distributed sort of teams that can work in a way there. I'm home today. It's great, that sort of thing. So I think we're conscious in a way that wasn't happening maybe 15, 20 years ago, and even 10 years ago. It is a thing, like I'm not as involved with those efforts because I'm not on the business side and sort of the corporate responsibility side of things. But, I see it from just, I definitely have been at dev studios that have, I think the easiest way for me to understand it is, you've been at dev studios and they would be like crunching and making the game, and they would get these big extravagant meals delivered because they need to stay and work there. That's sort of changed, right? The culture and especially COVID changed a lot of things. The pandemic period where people are now allowed to work at home, and it helps them sort of balance all that and helps them be healthier and helps everything be a little bit more conscious. And I think, as far as computing and those things we're getting more and more responsible and ethical about like making things fast, making things not take up as much processing or being processed in a way that's done that doesn't impact the environment. But I don't know a ton about it, I should say, but I know that like even just the shift to remote and hybrid work has been a big boon for that.
Absolutely. It's all about those tiny steps. And, it directly connects to Tony Stark's story. Like, he did not save the world with one big invention that he never changed. He
Right.
kept on tweaking, improving, and learning from each and every version of his suit. And it's like the same kind of thing with sustainability when we're talking about the gaming industry. The little steps, the little changes that you apply, each and everything counts. And I think I can even relate it to the normal school projects, the college projects that we do. Just simple steps like avoiding unnecessary printing, or reusing chart paper from other projects, and cutouts from our from other submissions, and code from our past work, or using shared platforms to collaborate better. It's all those mini choices that shape how we think, work, and create.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I will say, early in my career, the printer was used. I haven't printed something in I don't know how long. So, like definitely, from 19 years ago, we stopped printing everything, even, like doing digital magazine. Everything's digital magazines now. So like those shifts, I think still have helped, over time, and little steps along the way for sure.
Absolutely. And on that note, we are in endgame now. Let's kick things to a Stark level speed. Mr. Eric, are you ready to suit up for a rapid fire round?
Let's do it.
First up, if you had to teach an Atari era gamer about the meaning of Marvel's multiverse using only Tetris metaphors, how would you explain?
Okay, so Atari era gamer, so my dad. So I would say, using Tetris metaphors, the Marvel multiverse is about the different sort of ways that the terminals, which are the blocks in Tetris, can fall. So as these terminals are falling, sometimes they don't all align, and sometimes they create the L shape, sometimes you have a T shape. But if you get the right shape coming up next, you may be able to scooch something in, and it'll create a rift that opens up more lines so you can layer more things on top of it. And that's sort of how the multiverse works. There's rifts upon rifts and incursions that layer on top of each other. I think it did okay. That's like a B plus. I can't think of a better way, but that was a tough one.
Yes, I think it's like more about organized unpredictability when we
That's
talk
a
about
great
the
way to say it.
multiverse.
Yeah.
And like just like in Tetris, like the main thing is not like what drops next, but also how we respond to it. And
Yes.
when we are talking about such kind of strategy, let's imagine an athletic kind of strategy. Mr. Eric, imagine you're assembling a baseball dream team entirely out of Marvel superheroes. Who's
Yes.
making your roster? Who's pitching the heat? Who's your cleanup hitter? And why are they perfect for
Oh
this role?
man, this is like my favorite question. So there is a painting in the Marvel office in New York of X-Men playing baseball, and Cyclops is pitching, and that is the perfect person to pitch because with his optic blast, he would just deliver, pure heat, fastballs all day. So I think Cyclops is your pitcher. Cleanup hitter, Colossus. Colossus is actually a bat, big, strong. There's multiple. You could have Hulk as a cleanup hitter too if we're going outside the X-Men. I think first base, you want somebody who's a little acrobatic, but can catch anything thrown to them. So I'd say Beast. Second base, you typically want somebody a little sporty and fast. So maybe Quicksilver. For shortstop, you want your most athletic and get around the field really quickly. So Nightcrawler there. With third base, you want somebody who has a really good arm and can throw really well. So I would say that, let's say Havoc maybe could be that one. There's a couple other people. Cable. Let's go with Cable there. Colossus, who was a cleanup hitter, should be your catcher too. So you got your catcher. Center field, you want somebody who could fly. Let's put Storm there. Right field, you also want somebody with a really good arm. So I could say, actually, second base, let's go with Wolverine, now that I think about it, because he's short and you always have little guys. But right field, Banshee, maybe it could be a good right fielder. Left field, and I'm sticking purely in X-Men here just because I'm thinking of that painting. Left field, I think Rogue would be a great one for left field too. So that would be my lineup. I think they're perfect for these different roles because, the things you want for, like I said, Cyclops could pitch really fast. The Colossus is just a good backstop. Beast is acrobatic. Wolverine at second base is fast and agile. Nightcrawler can just teleport around the field and get whatever you need. And then Cable, cannon for an arm, that sort of thing. Storm can get to anything, fly anywhere. Banshee, same deal. So yeah, I think that would be my lineup. Going outside of that and thinking of the wider, I could go to the wider Marvel universe, but let's just stick with X-Men for now because that's what's in my head.
Awesome. And I love how each character's powers, they align with their position. But even more than that, how teamwork in storytelling, it mirrors sports so much. So yes, a deeper connection from there as well. And yes, we SDG Warriors will be sitting alongside Deadpool and cheering for Wolverine, of course.
Awesome.
And for Ultimate Chaos, Mr. Eric, imagine Doctor Strange opens a portal to the cosmic dimension of Coachella, where all music is emotion based. And now Frank Ocean taps into a Marvel hero's deepest memory for a live remix or duet. Whose memory is it? What genre do they invent? And what's the name of their breakout hit?
Okay, so Marvel Heroes' deepest memory. Logan Wolverine has the most fractured past, so it's got to be Logan's memory. I think they would invent a genre called, let's just call it emotional trauma core. And the name of the breakout hit would be, it'd probably have to be something very like country sounding. So, and sort of like R&B, soulful, chill. Let's use a Logan Wolverine catchphrase and just say the best at what I do. There we go.
I can't phrase it better. Absolutely. And I think that's such a vivid interpretation. Like, music, much like games, it gives voice to so many more emotions that words alone can't capture. And Frank Ocean, man, like his memories have this incredible way of capturing vulnerability and raw emotion. I mean, I would love to listen to their songs, honestly, if it comes to life.
Yeah.
I wish it comes.
Likewise.
Well, that was an absolute thrill, Mr. Eric, and it's been incredible to dive into your world building, your journey, and the power of storytelling to spark real empathy. As we wrap up our episode, let's reflect on everything we've learned with our last segment, the Inspire segment. Mr. Eric, who or what has the biggest inspiration in life and why?
So this is an extremely hard question for me, because there's a lot of people that have moved me. I read so many books, I've listened to a lot of music, consumed a lot of film, television, played a lot of games. It's really tough. Great storytellers are the people that tend to move me the most. That's why I'm in the career that I am. I think I'm going to name a couple people that really inspire me, but thinking about this, I was at NYU and there was a professor, Sukdev Sandhu, and he taught me this course, and it was a course where we would read one book, watch one film, and then listen to some music, and we had to figure out their cultural connection and their historical connection and what that meant. And so that was a really cool course to take. So an example is we would watch My Beautiful Laundrette. We would read Hanif Qureshi's Buddha Suburbia, and then we would listen to Pulp's Different Class. So Pulp was the album, My Beautiful Laundrette was a film, and Hanif Qureshi's Buddha Suburbia was the book. And all three of those things were about sort of British history, and also a lot about how the Indian diaspora in Britain and how people grew up in that period and what it was like to live there. And so, we would make those connections after we read the book and got the stories from that. And so, I remember moments in Buddha Suburbia about like the ideas around eating Turkish delight. My Beautiful Laundrette struggled with the idea of like being gay in a culture where gay wasn't accepted. And then Pulp's Different Class wasn't easily accepted, I should say. And then Pulp's Different Class was about like, what was happening in that sort of time period of the early 2000s and that sort of thing, which is when this sort of a lot of a wave of diaspora in Britain kind of happened. And so that really inspired me thinking about putting things in the cultural meaning and historical content. And then, like everything I've read, so many different authors, but Anais Nin, T.S. Eliot, Atul Gawande is one of my biggest heroes. He's somehow writes for the New Yorker, was like lead surgeon at Harvard, taught at Harvard, and had 3 kids. I don't know how you do that. He's an amazing writer. So Atul Gawande, Milan Kundera, I read a lot of. There's this a duo of women called Liz and Molly that write a lot about like emotional workplaces and how to deal with it. And I love Liz and Molly. Adam Grant I read a little bit of, but athletes too, Michael Jordan, Shohei Ohtani, Mike Trout, people like that, Jackie Robinson, obviously a huge inspiration for me. So I pull it from so many places, and I think that's really what's made me sort of just, I guess, approach games how I do and try to be as well-rounded as I am, I should say.
Absolutely. Superheroes are all around us. We just need to open our eyes and look for them. And, there's a very important thing about carrying forward a legacy. And speaking of that, Mr. Eric, what words of inspiration were given to you that you would like to pass along to others?
So my father and we talk baseball a lot. My father played a lot of baseball. I played a lot of baseball. So whenever we can, we'll either talk baseball or we played it when we could. He would work a lot, but he would always make time to show up at our games. And when I was 10 years old, I hit my first Little League home run, and I was routing the bases. And my father's the third base coach, and he's pointing at third base, and he's like, touch third, touch third. And I was just like, that's a weird thing to say. And he congratulated me after I got home. And then I was like, okay, I didn't know what that meant at the time. And then when I would fail at something or something like that, I would always get texts from him, and he'd be like, keep swinging, just keep swinging. And so what those taught me, touch third and keep swinging, was pay attention to the details. Don't get lost in the moment. Make sure you're focused and honed in and stay locked in on what you're doing. And then keep swinging is just about having the grit and determination to keep going, even if you aren't succeeding, even if you need to move on. And so those two phrases, touch third and keep swinging, are sort of like, those words of inspiration that I would like to pass on.
A big takeaway for our audience today: keep swinging, keep pushing forward, just like your heroes do. And finally, could you give the next generation of superheroes a call to action? What can we children and young people do to make the world a better place?
Be curious, be kind, and always ask questions. Those are the 3 things that I think are the most important aspects of life. We all need to have this sort of curiosity about us. We be kind to everybody. No questions are dumb questions. Just ask the questions, learn from people, share things with one another, and keep pushing humanity forward.
That's the spark that we all need. No matter the path, it's curiosity and asking tough questions,
Yes.
and keeping moving forward that lights the way forward. Mr. Eric, that was a true superhero origin story full of vision, courage, and heart. And, listening to how from your early days guiding museum visitors through stories of identity and expression, now you lead global teams and crafting worlds where players, they find themselves in the shoes of the heroes. Your path reminds us that every great story begins with curiosity and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. Thank you so much from the bottom of our little hearts for joining us and sharing your journey with our listeners today.
Thank you, Samara. It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope that this episode has inspired you to pick up your own creative mantle, to embrace uncertainty and your own origin moment, to use your own unique superpowers, be it storytelling, be it coding, or simply kindness, to shape the worlds and to spark change. If you haven't already, you can suit up and swing by the official Marvel Games headquarters at marvel.com/games to discover all the epic adventures waiting for you. And to deepen your knowledge of everything STEM, sustainability, and education, subscribe to the SDG Warriors podcast for in-depth discussions and meaningful conversations with real-world heroes at the ground like Mr. Eric, who are shaping a better world one action at a time. If you love this episode, help others discover it by leaving a review and sharing it with your friends, teachers, and family. Remember to stay curious and be the change. Until next time, it's Excelsior from the SDG Warriors.